After filling online application form, the next step is to fill Appendix 2. The difference between online application form and Appendix 2 is that online application form is filled and submitted online, while Appendix 2 can be downloaded from the link below. Once it's downloaded, it needs to be printed and filled by hand. It also needs to be filled from applicant's point of view. Now I will take you through how I filled my Appendix 2. When I clicked on the link provided in the presentation, it redirected me to this page here. So this is the UK Visas and Immigration letterhead, and it says Appendix 2. It was an August 2018 version, and it says it's a financial requirement form, and this form is for use outside the UK only, and it's provided free of charge. Since my wife was from Pakistan, so this form was the correct one for me. So before going through and started filling in, I read this form twice, especially the guidance notes at the very end. So I found these very helpful in answering my questions. Then I came back to the page 1 and read these things in order to make sure that this form is the correct one for me, and also everything here which says that please follow the guidance notes carefully and complete all the questions unless indicated to the contrary. Then I started filling the form in, and I found that you must complete or submit the personal details form BAF4A, which is the online version I registered in my previous video. And I explained in the previous video, and basically I started doing that. On what basis are you going to the UK? I mentioned as the spouse or civil partner of someone settled in UK. So this is again filled from applicant's point of view. So I clicked, I put cross in that one, and then on the relationship to the sponsor, I put please specify your relationship to the UK sponsor. Since I was the spouse, and I mentioned I put a cross in this box here. You can just read the others as well, just in case, which I've done. And I found that this was the right box and this was the right box as well. Now going to the next section, have you met your sponsor? I mentioned yes. When did you first meet your sponsor in person? I mentioned the date we first met. I met my wife, so I put the exact date here. It's very helpful to remember these dates for personal and home office reasons as well. And where did you first meet in person? So I put down the place I met my wife, and or she met me in person, since this is a Appendix 2 from applicant's point of view. And when did your relationship begin? I chose the date when me and my wife started talking with each other on WhatsApp. In my particular circumstance, me and my wife both developed chemistry immediately, and we know we were getting married to each other. And I found out that she was the right one. So I thought of using that date when I first talking with my wife, and I could also prove my communication with her in the form of chat logs and call logs. So I use that date. And how often do you meet? So I mentioned that here I mentioned that in a usual arrangement situation, we start living together once we got married. So I mentioned here that we've lived together since our wedding day at my family home in Pakistan. So I mentioned that. And when did you last see your sponsor? I mentioned in that question the last day, the day I was supposed to come back. So I was returning to UK. So I put that down here. And how do you keep in touch with your sponsor? I then mentioned FaceTime, social media, and WhatsApp, etc. Are you seeking permission to come to the UK as a fiancé or proposed civil partner to enable your marriage or civil partnership to take place in the UK? This is not the box relevant for me, so I put no here. And are you married in a civil partnership with your sponsor? I mentioned yes. When and where did you enter your civil partnership? Then I mentioned the date and the address of the marriage hall where we got married. And then what age were you married? So I put my wife's age here. And what age was your sponsor? So I put my age here when we got married. And the next question is this was an arranged marriage? I said yes. And are you and your sponsor related outside marriage? Which we aren't, so I mentioned no. And I put a note applicable here as well. If you are unmarried or same-sex partner, this doesn't apply to me, so I put not applicable here because I was a married partner with my wife, and put a not applicable here as well. And 1.18, do you intend to live with your sponsor permanently? I mentioned yes, of course. Have you lived with your sponsor in a relationship akin to marriage or civil partnership at any time, including since your wedding or civil partnership ceremony? Put a cross in the relevant box. I mentioned yes, and I put all the details here, which basically means that we started living together since our wedding day at my sponsor's family home in Pakistan. Are either you or your sponsor currently married or in a civil partnership with another person? The answer was no, and I put not applicable here as well. Have you or your sponsor previously been married? The answer was no, so I mentioned put a mark here. And then if there has been more than one relationship, provide detail in 6, which was irrelevant. So what languages do you speak well? I mentioned what languages my wife speaks well, so I mentioned English, Urdu. Here I mentioned my languages, and then what language do you and your sponsor use to communicate with each other? And I mentioned the languages which I use, English and Urdu. Do you and your sponsor have any shared financial responsibilities? This is incorrect. So I do not have any shared financial responsibilities at that time of application. Do you or your sponsor have any physical or mental condition which requires personal care or medical assistance at home, or having learning difficulties? I mentioned no again, and not applicable here. Does your sponsor have any children? I mentioned no, not applicable. Coming to page 4. Is your sponsor responsible for supporting anyone financially, including any children listed above? I mentioned no. Your accommodation and other details. So where do you and your sponsor plan to live in the UK? I mentioned my sponsor address, or my address where I'm currently living. Does your sponsor own this property? I mentioned yes. Does your sponsor live in a council-owned property? I said no. Is your sponsor in receipt of housing benefit or council tax benefit? I mentioned yes, and I put the details down here, which was basically 25% discount on or a single person discount. In some councils, they allow a single person discount. So I mentioned that. How many bedrooms are there in property? I mentioned the number of bedrooms. How many other rooms are there in property, excluding kitchen, bathroom, and toilet? I mentioned here as well. Does anyone other than your sponsor live in the property? I mentioned no, since I was my sponsor or myself, or my wife's sponsor, which is myself, was living alone. So, do you intend to work in UK? I mentioned yes. I explained about the details. So basically my wife is a doctor, so I explained that after passing the PLAB exam for UK, she can get the GMC registration and start working. So in fact, after passing the PLAB examination, she'll be able to work in the UK. So I mentioned here. Then I mentioned financial requirement. So the part 3 was about exemption from meeting the financial requirement. So the first thing was, is your sponsor in receipt of a disability related or carer's benefit listed within the guidance notes? The answer was no, so I put a cross in here. What is the financial requirement you are required to meet? Applying with no child dependents under 18 and income before tax of at least 18,600 a year. So this was the relevant category, so I put a cross X in here in that box. and I left all others without filling anything in. And then if you're applying with more than 3 dependent children, I left this box as well. If you are applying with more than 3 child dependents under 18, you must demonstrate an income before tax. Blah blah blah. Doesn't really relevant to me. It's not really relevant. So indicate the financial requirement you must meet here. So I mentioned 18,600 a year here, and then coming down, meeting the financial requirement. So from the list below, please indicate the main method of meeting the financial requirement. Income from salaried employment in the UK, I mentioned yes. I put cross here. Indicate which option you are relying on. I mentioned category A. Let me take you to the guidance notes before I move any forward. This category A I chose because if it says here somewhere 3A. So yeah, 3A, your sponsor's income from salary employment in the UK. Is your sponsor currently employed in UK? Answer yes. If no, go to part 3B. And what is your sponsor job's title? I think, yeah, let me explain it. Basically, 3A was if I am in a salaried employment for past for last year, I was in the same salaried employment with the same employer. So I would like to, I should choose 3A, and 3B is for those people who have moved their jobs in past 12 months. So I didn't move my job. I was working with my current employer for about 4 years. So I thought of, so this 3A was relevant for me. Indicate which option you're relying on and mention category A. So then I came down to part 3A. Here, so it mentions your sponsor income from salaried employment in the UK. And then I said, okay, so only complete this section if your sponsor is working in the UK. This section contains information relevant to the category A or B. Ways to meet the financial requirement as set out in the policy guidance notes. Is your sponsor currently employed in the UK? I mentioned yes. What is your sponsor job title? I put my job title here. What is the name of your sponsor employer? I mentioned my sponsor employer here. On which date, on what date did your sponsor commence this employment? So I put this date here, like date of my commencement of employment. What is the sponsor national insurance number? I put the national insurance number here. What type of employment is this? I put permanent employment here. What is the address, phone number, and email address of your sponsor's employer? So I put all the full postal address and postcode, and the landline number, and the mobile number, and the email address. What is the sponsor annual income before this employment, from this employment before tax? So I mentioned my income, which was above the threshold of 18,600. And then, has your sponsor been in employment with the same employer earning this amount as detailed in 3.11 continuously for 6 months prior to the date of application? So I mentioned yes. And this was then he says if yes, go to 3.21. So I went to 3.21 and I briefly checked what it was. Wow, the other was 3.13 was, so it was, has your sponsor had any other salaried employment in UK in 12 months prior to the application? So there wasn't in my case, since I mentioned that I was in with the same employer for about past 4 years. So I come to 3.21. Does your sponsor annual income before tax from their current salaried employment meet or exceed the financial requirement you must meet? So financial requirement is 18,600. My sponsor's salary was above this threshold, in fact significantly above, so I mentioned yes. And then that's all from, I think, yes, that was it, because all of the sections relate to part 3B and self-employment, and if you are meeting all the financial requirements through savings or other non-employment sources, etc. So that pretty much was it. Yeah, on the part 5, is there any other information you wish to be considered as part of application? I didn't mention anything, so I just put not applicable. So that was it as far as the Appendix 2 is concerned.